Aragorn, Hornburg hero, has quickly become one of my all-time favorite commanders. At first glance I thought Renown might be a little too slow for what I was trying to do, but boy was I wrong. His doubling ability gets absolutely ridiculous, and I soon learned this brew can be geared up for some real Naya turbo counter action. So if your playstyle is turning creatures sideways, then this is the brew for you. Just a quick note, this deck is not on a budget, but I do love playing with it so much I might just have to build a budget version in the future. Alright, so getting into it, sure, Aragorn puts a 1/1 counter on creatures who deal that initial instance of combat damage, but going from 1 counter, getting in for damage again, only to double to 2 is probably balanced, but just a tad bit slow, and we want to get that ball rolling a lot faster. So on that note, 2 key aspects that really make this brew dangerous is with creatures that are already modified, have double strike, or a combination of the two. This way we can really lean to Aragorn's second ability, and overwhelm our opponents with that doubling process without starting at ground zero. Starting off, Hydras are a classic go-to when it comes to entering with counters, but these in particular are going to shine for our strategy as well as just about anything with an X cost. And there's plenty of great tech when it comes to these bad boys. So Moloch and Turvagon from the Warhammer decks are solid includes here. If we've got enough mana, these can draw us a card with Ravenous, but the important thing is Moloch, although not as versatile as something like Voracious Hydra, can be decent removal, and Turvagon alone has the potential to create an obscene board state, especially when we give him double strike. And the brand new Rampaging Yaogwai is going to make the brew. Vigilance and Trample are incredible keywords with first strike Aragorn gives, not to mention it's capable of some insane artifact and enchantment removal. And I'm not too worried about triple green pips in this brew, as green is going to be our most dominant color anyway. And Shivan Devastator is one of my favorites because of how flexible it can be. This thing is good no matter how early or how late the game is, and is almost always going to connect with at least one of our opponents reliably. I'm never mad to see this guy in my hand. And next of course is that Savageborn Hydra. Having that native double strike is pretty invaluable, and if push comes to shove, I guess we can just keep making him bigger after the fact. Samit, Voice of Dissent is a Brewski MVP for sure. This card gets better as you read it, and that untapped synergy pushes it over the top. Also, Gimli is another solid addition here. He has surprised me consistently through playtesting so far, and that middle ability has decent potential as we are running enough legendaries in this current brew to make it worthwhile. And Krenko, although with no inherent evasion besides Aragorn's first strike, has proved to be a menace during playtesting. I mean, who knew, but I have had multiple games where he was left unchecked and the goblins themselves became a massive threat. Regardless, he makes good chump blockers as most times we are going to be tapped out. I didn't throw in a ton of recursion for this brew. Of course, for attack matters decks, Sun Titan is always a great choice, but I chose Guardian Scalelord here. He's a little cheaper and that backup is great synergy. With this thing will reliably return key pieces we need each combat as its power grows and grows. I'm going to mention Elder Gargaroth here as well. This thing is just busted value and he's already above rate. When you add first strike to all those other keywords and tack on card draw, it's bonkers, and I would strongly consider it if you can fit him. Since we're adding busted green creatures, Questing Beasts add some nice flavor to our keyword soup, as no one is going to be blocking this thing with first strike, let alone a chump block with that second line of text, and I specifically like him in case an opponent is trying to throw any fogs in our plans. And I want to quickly add Helena and Elena. Similar to cards like Xenagos, they're going to drive pretty well with our counters theme. Buffing power each combat and granting haste is especially nice. If we can manage to get counters on them as well, it's going to get out of hand. Moving into more evasion here, we want to make sure we can reliably get our creatures renowned to begin with and get that doubling effect online. Since Aragorn gives our attacking creatures first strike, if we pair that with some other great keywords, we can ensure our opponents are never blocking until they absolutely have to, and by then it's too late. Sirach and Goreclaw are a no-brainer between giving us trample, haste, and +1/+1 counters. Additionally, we want to emphasize giving our whole board trample with includes like Kodama the Westry. I'd say Kodama is another MVP with the evasion he brings along with super solid ramp. Another great piece is Orin Frostfang. Again, first strike Death Touch might just be the best keyword combo, and once we connect for some damage, draw cards and watch our counters double. And then real quick, Kutzel from the recent Ixalan set is solid here too. I love the Grand Abolisher type effects where I can fit them, and she goes here perfectly with some added card draw. More mentions are cards like Champion of Lambholt. Enough counters on her and our board is virtually unblockable. And then I think a fun include here is Miri. Restricting how our opponents block is great while also mitigating attacks on the clapback from our opponents. Abzan Falconer is amazing and can even be dropped in the late game as a win con. And Iroha Scout of Victory is a high power include, making it that much harder to block our stuff, on top of preventing damage. So those are just some great creature examples, but there are loads of effects from just about any card type in the game to get around blockers or just connecting with that combat damage in general. Several of these are also just going to be win cons at the right time, and if we can get them running early enough, we're going to be knocking players out of the game before they can set up. Alright, so any one of these 3 enchantments are going to get that clock ticking for your opponents. Running more than 1 or 2 is probably overkill, but since we care mostly about attacking, Berserker's Onslaught might be the top pick for 1 less mana. Quende and Blade Historian are also doing basically the exact same thing here. And when it comes to taking out one opponent out of nowhere, Embercleave and Temur Battle Rage are tried and true. Lastly, Invasion of Ikoria is a good tutor for non-humans, and then makes all of them essentially unblockable on the backside. Then Bow of Naya, bringing some utility you most likely won't need, but it's hard to beat that first strike death touch. Tons of ways to ramp in these colors, but there are several creatures you should consider as they're going to be the backbone of this brew. Birds of Paradise almost goes without saying if you're in green and have more than 2 colors, and Biophagus is a great synergy piece here. He's a 2 mana dork that adds any color we need, but if we're casting a creature we get an added bonus. Next up, a couple of classics here are Fabro Elder and Bloomtender. These are consistently going to let us cast multiple spells a turn, and it's nice that the Elder has Vigilance, in case we're in the position to attack with them. Next up, Kami of Whispered Hopes is a counter brew auto-include, even if we never end up buffing its power. The additional +1/+1 effect this thing adds is always nice to have. And Crystalline Crawler is also a decent mention. If we can get counters stored on this thing, then it'll gear us up for an explosive turn. And you might have guessed it, but MVP here is going to be Selvala, Heart of the Wilds. She's going to ensure we're snowballing with mana right in sync with all our counter shenanigans. Alright, now for the fun part. These next few cards, aside from Aragorn's second ability, are really what's going to make this deck get out of control, and when you have a few of these in play, pair that with Double Strike and get ready to do some math. As mentioned before, Colonian Hydra is definitely a staple, doing some heavy lifting here and can destroy your opponents by itself if it has to. Vorinclex is obviously amazing here too if you're not budgeting, but any of these effects like that of Branching Evolution are honestly all you need, and having multiple can quickly start to feel like too many. These 2 from the March of the Machine precons are a couple of brew all-stars here. I really like the backup mechanic, and the Sledge Captain can take out a player on the same turn it comes down if it targets a creature with Double Strike. And Bright Palm gives us more of that doubling effect, while also making it a bit harder to block. Now the new Power Fist from Fallout is just Sledge Captain's ability on an equipment, and Sovereign Okenek is another broken legendary that's essentially doubling counters as well. I would also consider Court of Garenbrig as an include. Yes, you need to keep the Monarch for that doubling effect, but for 3 mana and the counters you get from it, this card isn't really asking much. Lastly, Vigor has been annoying commander players since its release, and no better way to guarantee a lose-lose for your opponents. Okay, moving on into extra overkill mode, lots of doubling counters, we got lots of Double Strike, and a splash of extra combats is going to give your opponents little to no time to breathe, and that's where creature cards like Aurelia and the new Anzrag the Quake will come in. They're both game ending, but with Anzrag it's really pick your poison given he gets first strike, and if they don't block he either gets huge or our opponents give us extra combat. Since this brew isn't going to be making a ton of friends, while we double counters focusing on whoever makes sense to attack, Shalai and Halar will be throwing all that damage towards someone else. This is going to make cards like All Be One great in this deck too, but I do find it much better on a flying vigilance creature. And finally, a trusty Akroma's Will is going to be there to close out the game when you need it. I didn't really go into lands for this video, but definitely check out the whole deck list. One that I just had to keep in the brew was Inkmoth Nexus. It's so hard for your opponents to deal with as it turns back into a land, but gets to keep all its counters. It'll frighten your opponents for sure, but it's a fun little addition. Pair it with a Kessig Wolf Run to really cause some trouble. As always, thank you so much for watching. A like and subscribe would be a huge help, and if you have any ideas I didn't mention, or something I missed, be sure to let me know in the comments.